This is about defending democracy. This is no longer Democrats versus Republicans. What do you want your kids to believe in? There must be give and take.
This is White Flag with Joe Walsh.
Hey, former Congressman Joe Walsh. This is White Flag with Joe Walsh. Hope you're having a good week. Thanksgiving week. I don't do this enough, and I should do this more. I don't promote this podcast as much as I should. White Flag with Joe Walsh. Tell everybody you know about it. If anybody wants to email me directly, I respond to every single email, no matter what. Even if you just want to rip me a good one, feel free. Joe Walsh, White Flag at gmail.com. That's all one word. Joe Walsh, White Flag at gmail.com. Feel free to critique the podcast or just give me your thoughts on anything. We're going to do something different this week, and I'm looking forward to this. A gentleman who I've become friends with, Chuck Kilo, Dr. Chuck Kilo, he's a physician, I want to throw that in, is going to, I don't know what he's going to do, but he's going to interview me. I spend my weeks on this podcast generally interviewing and having a conversation with someone. I'm out there all the time, but I don't talk about myself much. So we're just going to try this, and Chuck has become a friend. He is a concerned citizen of this country, and I know, getting to know him, how much he cares about this country. So with that, my friend, I'm done. It's yours. Hello.
Well, thank you, Joe. What a pleasure to have the opportunity to interview you. I've been an ardent listener for probably 2 years, listened to just about every episode. I really have learned just a tremendous amount from the podcast and then from our direct engagement with each other. And so I'm excited about helping the listeners getting to understand you a little bit, your background, how you got to where you are, and what your thinking is for today, and including some of your positions, exploring some of that. So I totally appreciate your approach in general. It is incredibly respectful in terms of how you engage with people, and you certainly evolve towards that. It's genuine, it's inquisitive, it's open-minded. The depth of your thinking and exploration are just impressive. So this Thanksgiving week, Joe, I'm thankful for you, and I really appreciate the model that you've built for respectful discussions.
Chuck, I appreciate that, and I want to say to everybody listening to us right now, there are no rules, my friend. You can ask me anything, and we can talk about anything. Nothing is off limits.
Amen. I look forward to that. Well, I think, we're going to kind of roughly divide this up into 3 parts. I think first we'll just explore some of your personal background, which I find fascinating, just to understand some of your trajectory and whatnot. The second piece is to understand your thinking about kind of current political trends, how we got to where we are today. And then the third is to explore some of your positions and how you think about that. You are a libertarian on the conservative side. You talk about that all the time. I totally respect that. And so we'll explore a little bit more about that so that the listeners can understand you from that perspective as well.
Fantastic, my friend. Yes, thank you.
All right, good. Well, when we first started to get to know each other and when I started looking more at your background, I was a little bit shocked to understand that you were a social worker early on. So it is a little bit odd for somebody with that background to move towards kind of far-right politics. So why don't you tell us a little bit maybe about your family life growing up, and then how did you get into the social work world? What did that mean to you? What was your preference in that regard? And then how did you move from there into the kind of the politics that you entered
Everybody,
into?
Chuck, is shocked when they find out that I did a lot of social work and I also did a lot of teaching. I come from a big old Irish Catholic family, 9 kids. Mom and dad both passed away about 4 to 5 years ago. And I don't know how you were raised, Chuck, but I was raised by my dad especially not to talk about ourselves. and not to boast and not to brag. And so that's really become ingrained in me. I have always been mission driven. From my earliest memory, Chuck, I've always kind of gravitated toward a more limited government because I've always been attracted by the notion of us out here in the private sector helping us out here in the private sector. So I've always kind of had that more limited government libertarian philosophy combined with the fact that I've just been mission driven my whole life. I've never been driven by money. I've never made a lot of money. I've always been driven by trying to do good and help teach people. So I did get into I did get into social work. I taught I spent a lot of time teaching high school dropouts in the city of Chicago basic job training skills and basic reading, writing, and math skills. I felt, and maybe you'll disagree with me, because I get asked this question a lot I have over the years by friends, why would a libertarian become a social worker? Because to me, it was consistent with my philosophy in that I didn't want a big old government program to take care of low-income kids on the south side of Chicago. I wanted to as a private citizen. So I've tried to live some of that as well, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. And yeah, that's you reminded me about your background as a teacher, which I also really appreciate. And I think that point is a good one. As much as I may disagree with some friends who live on the farther right side of the spectrum, at the same time, many of them are very dedicated to social causes. They volunteer a lot and things like that. So it's probably a little bit of an inherent bias that those kind of surprises pop up in us when they really shouldn't.
You know this. You and I have talked about this. We don't know each other enough, us Americans, and we no longer speak to each other if you don't think like us. We assume that everybody on the right is cold-hearted and doesn't give a damn about people less fortunate than them. And people on the right assume that everybody on the left doesn't believe in markets and capitalism and entrepreneurship, which is all a bunch of bullshit as well.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I am, as you know, I am a little bit I'm a centrist, a little bit to the left of center, probably. Well, I'm not sure anymore. I'm probably firmly center, these days. I'm a capitalist, an entrepreneur, an investor, and routinely get accused of being a kind of a left-wing socialist by people who don't know me. And so I think you're right. We label each other way too quickly, and that's unfortunate.
You and I are similar in that way, in that you've devoted your life as a physician and in other regards to doing good, but you've also been an entrepreneur. You've also done things and made money and combined both of those.
Right. Yeah. So from the social work, you did kind of move towards more right-wing politics, and then eventually got elected to Congress. So dissect that a little bit for us. Tell us
I've
happened.
always been political. I get that from my mom. My mom was a student of American history. She embedded that in me. I've always been fascinated by American history and politics. I kind of believe in reincarnation. I kind of believe that I lived during the Revolutionary period. My mom and I would always fight. She loved John Adams. I loved Thomas Jefferson. I enjoyed teaching immensely, but I always knew that I wanted to do something a little more macro. The issue that I cared the most about when I was back in my social work teaching days was this issue of school choice, allowing parents of kids to choose where their kids go to school, public, private, Catholic, religious, homeschool, and then the tax dollars would follow that decision. I became an advocate for that issue, that policy issue of school choice around the country. That led me to run for Congress the first time in 1996. Didn't have a prayer. I knew I didn't have a prayer. I've always lived in very democratic areas, lived in a very democratic area, ran as a Republican, didn't win. I had little kids, young kids at that time. I had an unhappy first marriage that I stayed in for a long time. Catholic kid, right? You don't get divorced. You have kids. You're there forever, or at least as long as the kids are at home. So I never really thought about running for Congress again because of my domestic situation until 2009, 2010, when Obama was president. Obamacare was an issue that I had real issues with, but mostly it was, and this seems so almost, oh my God, Chuck, this seems kind of bizarre. Our debt at that time was $11 trillion, and I was incensed about our national debt. And I was pissed off at both parties for pretty much placing all of this debt on the backs of our kids and our grandkids. So I became angry in 2009, and I had no rhyme or reason to run for Congress, but I rolled the dice and did. So I was living kind of on the north, in the northern suburbs of Chicago. I had divorced my first wife, sharing custody with the kids. I grew up in the northwest suburbs in a town called Barrington. A Democrat congresswoman represented that district. So I decided to move back to my home district where I grew up to run. And I ran in a very crowded Republican primary, 8 or 9 candidates, but I won the primary going away. And then I took on this Democratic congresswoman. And Chuck, nobody on the planet thought I had a prayer, because right after I won the primary, it came out that financially I was a mess. I foreclosed on a condo. I wasn't making any money. I was in big debt. And again, this all sounds really crazy because in this post-Trump world, none of that matters anymore. But I was poor. I had bad credit. And the Republican Party, Chuck, wanted nothing to do with me. So they wrote me off. The local party did, the national party did. And so after I won the primary, all by myself with a bunch of grassroots supporters, I took this Democratic congresswoman on and won by 291 votes. It wasn't, oh my gosh. I didn't lead this, but the anger and concern I felt connected with the anger and concern that most voters at that time felt as well. You and I could argue for days about the Tea Party. I proudly rode the Tea Party wave. There's good and bad to the Tea Party. I identify a lot with the good, and a lot of that good, Chuck, a lot of people of all ages and all colors really upset with how big government was getting in all of this debt. That's what I ran on, and I spoke to that, and none of the other candidates really did. And so I think it was that. I connected with sort of the zeitgeist of where people were in that moment.
Yeah. Right. And so you entered into Congress kind of as a freshman Tea Party guy.
I was alone. I entered. 62 Republicans got elected that year. I was the only Republican that got elected without a dime of support from the party. And Chuck, it's important that I mention that I ran as a Republican, but I ran against the Republican Party too. I got angry at both parties, and because of that, the Republican Party really didn't embrace me. I wasn't a young man. I was in my mid to late 40s at the time. A lot of young members who get elected, right? Their eyes are big, the lights are big, and lobbyists are whining and dining them. I didn't want any of that bullshit. I went there to do business. So I pretty much was kind of all by myself.
Yeah. And what was your experience? Tell us about what happened those first couple of years and what that was like for
Well,
you.
I again, I guess it's the experience of my life. I went there on a mission. I went there to scream from the mountaintop from day one. I slept on the floor of my office. I didn't meet with a lobbyist. I came home every weekend and held more town halls than any other member of Congress. I wanted to get down to business. I got on TV a lot. I wanted to put my mug everywhere I could put it. So I became branded kind of as a lone ranger. Now, it's also important to note, Chuck, that this was right before redistricting. It was in 2010, and then we redistrict every 10 years. So new districts then were drawn. Yeah,
We
in
as in
Illinois,
Illinois.
around the country. The Democrats controlled Illinois. So about halfway through my term, the Democrats and the Republicans got together to draw me a new Democratic district that I didn't have much of a chance of winning in, but I took that fight on as well. So I never really felt like I enjoyed my time in Congress. I felt like I was always running
Right.
to do something.
Right. Yeah, yeah. And how would you describe your personal platform? What were you advocating for? What were your the key areas of interest?
The first two bills I introduced in Congress were my areas of interest. I introduced a term limits bill, limiting every member of the House to 3 two-year terms and every member of the Senate to 2 six-year terms. And I introduced a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. Neither one obviously went anywhere, but those were the two issues that drove me. I believed, Chuck, in my heart that our founders intended for us to send citizen legislators to Washington. I wanted to live that. I had self-limited myself. I had said I would never serve more than 6 years. Again, I slept on the floor of my office. I didn't take any congressional benefits. It really pissed my wife off. I didn't take the pension, the health care, anything. I felt like I was just a citizen legislator, go there for a few years, then come home. And I really felt like we were spending too much money. So that's what drove me.
Right, right, yeah. And so you were out there at the time. You had some colleagues who were somewhat aligned with you. You talk about being fairly good friends with Jim Jordan at that time. Talk a little bit about that. Who was moving in your same direction? Who did you feel you were closest
So I did.
to?
I got elected again in that Tea Party wave. So a number of folks like me. Jordan was there a couple years ahead of me, but guys like Mick Mulvaney, who we know, Mike Pompeo, I got elected with, Tim Scott, who just stepped down, who was running for president. There was a group of about 10 or 11 of us who were known of as kind of the Tea Party caucus. And we made life hell for our new speaker, John Boehner. I mean, hell. We were the equivalent, Chuck, of what the Matt Gaetzes and the Marjorie Taylor Greens are today. Not nearly as crazy, and always focused on the issue spending. We didn't get into all the bull crap that they get into these days. But back then, Chuck, if you look back at the media back then, it was Joe Walsh and Jim Jordan and these crazy Tea Party guys. That's what we were. It became the precursor to then what was the Freedom Caucus.
Yeah, I mean being focused on term limits and the debt in balanced budgets is fairly rational. It does not begin to get into the realm of irrationality, even though it's a hard fight for lots of political reasons.
Well, that Joe Walsh, Chuck, that
but
Joe
the party-
Walsh you would have liked. The Joe Walsh you wouldn't have liked back then was, and I identify as a populist. I've had a lot of discussions with people who find populism always bad. I think populism can be good or bad, but I also was a populist politician. I got a lot angrier about some of the social cultural stuff. Some of it still bothers me, but I went over my skis on some of it as well, because that was, Chuck, a big part of what kind of the bad part of the Tea Party movement was, some of this social stuff.
So there are goods and bads in the populist movement, good and bads in the Tea Party thinking. There's overlap between those. Describe a little bit of that from your perspective. Goods and bads of the Tea Party, goods and bad of populism. And you may want to describe populism because not a lot of people kind of connect with what that means, even though the term is kind of
I'm
thrown
a
around
populist, and I think we are living in the midst of a big populist moment in American history. What does that mean? That just means to me that our political system is utterly disconnected from and unresponsive to regular folk out there. That's why we got Donald Trump. That's why Bernie Sanders did so well and probably should have beaten Hillary Clinton in 2016. The two parties have kind of lost their way. I would argue that our political system has lost its way. The way we elect people in many ways has lost its way. And regular people are angry. And that's a good thing. Now that anger can be channeled to bad things. The Tea Party, the good of the Tea Party is government's too big, we're bankrupting our kids and grandkids. The bad of the Tea Party is I don't like brown and black people. I want to build a wall around America, and I want America to be a lovely white Christian country again. That's the bad part of the Tea Party. I heard a lot of that back then, and I did not do a strong enough job back then quelling it.
And so you're obviously alluding to where that movement and subsequently the entire Republican Party evolved.
So, yeah.
And you were living.
No, Chuck, you're spot on. And I was living it. So I went to Washington, like a lot of us Tea Party people did, to do something about the good part of the Tea Party, the debt. I realized in one afternoon I couldn't do anything about the debt. And once we Republicans did not deliver on the debt, I think a lot of the Tea Party folks in America out there then turned to their bad side. And this is then what set the stage for Trump. And he came along and he tapped into the bad part of the Tea Party. I mean, in that very first speech, when he came down that escalator and said, I'm going to build a wall across America. When he said that, Chuck, I was on the radio at the time. I became a right-wing radio talker after I left Congress. And the minute Trump announced in 2015 and he said, I'm going to build a wall and Mexico's going to pay for it, every Republican establishment person contacted me and said, this guy's a joke. But every Republican voter called into my radio show and said, I fucking love it. Finally, somebody's talking my language. So I knew then that he had tapped into it.
Yeah, he said he was
a
going to
border
build a
wall,
border
and
wall.
Mexico was going to pay for it.
Border wall, yeah. Right. So you served.
I
how
served
many
that
terms?
one term, and then I got redistricted out.
A redistrict, and then you went from there to being to have your radio show.
Yeah. And it became a nationally syndicated radio show. The one thing I established in my time in Congress was I could speak. And so they put me on the radio, and pretty quickly I was around the country and went on Fox News multiple times every day. And I was in that right-wing media world for, 6, 7, 8 years.
Yeah. And do you think at that time Fox was following or Fox was leading kind of the populist thought?
Both. Yeah, both. And I knew this from, Rush Limbaugh was the king of this, manipulating his listeners. I was very good on the radio, but I knew, Chuck, that I could get my listeners inflamed. I could get them pissed off. I could talk about, rising black crime in the Chicago suburbs to inflame my listeners. I could talk about the fact that you're not allowed to say Merry Christmas at this one Christmas parade in Indiana, and that would inflame them. So it is a weird relationship, the chicken and the egg thing, but I think it's both.
Yeah, yeah. And Fox is, I think, emblematic of the fact that it is a lot easier to engage people with negative comments, with fear, with things like that, as opposed to thoughtful commentary and asking people to dig deep in their soul and in their thoughtfulness about current issues.
The better you can scare people, the business model is, the better you'll do. No doubt about it. Now, again, Fox Now, I would argue that once Trump came on the scene, to me, Donald Trump's greatest legacy, Chuck, is the destruction of truth. Because where before Trump, Fox News was clearly fear-based and biased to the right, boom, 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 and there were issues with the truth. Now, I mean, Fox News and the right-wing media world now isn't even dealing in the world of truth anymore.
Right, yeah. I think a lot of people confuse that. There is a big difference between, political spin, which has been present as long as humans have existed and had, governments or leadership. There's a big difference between spin and overt lying to the public. And conspiracy theory and fiction, and Fox made that transition.
They paid a handsome price for that when it comes to the 2020 election, literally lying to their viewers about that election.
Yeah. So you are back to, you're on the radio show. Trump gets elected. You supported him initially. You voted for him in 2016. And then what happened to you? Tell us what was going through your mind. You changed dramatically, whereas people like Jim Jordan continue to move in that trajectory towards conspiracy theory, lying to the public, and whatnot. What was going on with you, and what was going on with them?
So, important context. I voted for and supported Trump in 2016. Primarily, Chuck, because his voters and supporters were my voters and supporters and my listeners. And I knew, we're talking about how angry, scared, and concerned they were. I knew that, and I spoke to a lot of that. So I understood why people wanted Trump in the White House. When Trump would say shit like, I'm going to go there and I'm going to burn it down, I'm going to drain the swamp, all of that, that's a lot of what I had been saying since I was in Congress. And you and I haven't talked about this. The notion of disruption in the private sector is important. I've always felt our political world needs some disruption and has needed some. There's good disruption, bad disruption. Trump turned out to be a horribly evil disruptor, but I understood why he was a disruptor. So I voted for him and supported him. But I did a lousy job, and I have had to publicly apologize for 5 years now because I didn't pay enough attention back then to what a bad person he was. I didn't take him seriously. I privately thought, Chuck, if he wins in 2016, he'll appoint a bunch of good people and he'll go play golf and maybe a couple good things might happen. I was wrong. So the minute he got elected in 2016, I'm on the radio all over the country. I'm on Fox News everywhere. I really finally began to pay attention to him. And Chuck, within a month and a half of his being sworn in, I came home from the radio that night. I sat down, had dinner with my wife, and I said to her, I said, this is not going to end well for us. And at this time, for the first time in my life, Chuck Kilo, I am making money. I'm on the rise. I'm going to be the next Rush Limbaugh. I could do whatever. But I turned to my wife and I said, this is not going to end well for us because I'm going to have to publicly come out against him. And the two things that set me off, Chuck, right at the beginning were every time he opened his mouth, he lied. I'm a politician. I know politicians have an issue with the truth. This guy, every time he speaks, I don't care who you are. I can't have someone in my government lying to me like that. But then the second thing, Chuck, that really bugged me out of the gate was, and you remember this, Trump wins in November, and then we find out that Russia did all of that to help him win. And after Trump won, he found out everything Russia did. And instead of saying, this is outrageous, I'm going to appoint a commission because we can never have a foreign country attacking our country like this. Trump didn't do that. He got defensive and pissed off because he thought it might tarnish his victory. And so he began to lie about the whole Russia thing. So that then began a year-long spiral downward where I, month after month, turned against him.
Yeah. And then your radio show and your engagement with Fox took turns.
I was on the radio about 8 months ago up in Canada, and the host, Chuck, introduced me as Joe Walsh, former congressman, former presidential candidate, the guy who took a blowtorch to his career. And I just started laughing because no one's described it like that. I literally took a blowtorch to my career. I publicly came out against Trump. So there went the radio show. There went Fox News. There went any chance to ever really run as a Republican again. By the way, the final straw was Helsinki in the summer of 18, when Trump stood in front of the world and said, I believe Putin and not my own people. I went on the radio that night and I said to my audience, all Trumpers, I'm going to do every fucking thing I can do to make sure this guy doesn't win again. That was it.
Yeah. And so things changed at that time. You changed your own personal strategy. A couple years passed, you decided to run for president against Trump.
So I publicly turned against Trump in 17 and 18. And then we've got an election coming up in 2020. I'm barely hanging on, trying to rub two pennies together because I walked away from everything. But I thought, my God, why isn't a Republican challenging this man? He's a criminal. He's a traitor. He abhors our Constitution. I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times and I implored John Kasich, Mitt Romney, somebody run against this guy, primary him. Nobody would. So I thought, okay, the hell with it. I'm committed to doing everything I can to make sure he's not reelected. I don't have a chance, but if I mount a primary challenge against him, maybe I can wound him for the general election. So I did. So I announced a primary challenge. Away we went. I started campaigning in Iowa and New Hampshire. Chuck, within 20 days of my announcing against Trump, the Republican Party literally canceled 22 primaries and caucuses in 22 states. So I realized it was mission impossible.
Yeah. Well, it's a great trajectory. You were changing. You were being honest. The Jim Jordans of the world, hate to keep
Feel free.
Pointing to him. Yeah, we could say Mike Johnson. He's just only recently becoming more of a public figure. They continue to move in the opposite direction. What differentiates you from them? Talk about that.
That's a really good question. And I'm asked a variation of this a lot. How many of my former colleagues, Republican colleagues in Congress and former right-wing media colleagues really like Trump, or are they just saying this publicly? Most, Chuck, privately agree with what I say about Trump. From the moment I came out against Trump, I mean, a bunch of my former colleagues privately over the years have contacted me and say, I love what you're saying. I can't say it. Here's the deal. Because if you do what I did, Chuck, as a Republican, you take a blowtorch to your career. You're done. And look, being in Congress is a really nice gig. Being on Fox News is a nice gig. Having a talk radio show is a nice gig. It's hard to give up that power and that money and that prestige. So you, in essence, sell a big part of yourself to keep it. Chuck, I couldn't live with myself if I had done that. I just couldn't.
Yeah. I appreciate that. Let's turn a little bit to then your kind of what's happening in the body politic in general, and it kind of explore some of that from your perspective and see what we can learn from some of that. I think that as I put together history, and lots of people are writing about this now. I go back to Reagan. This is grossly inaccurate and incomplete. I go back to Reagan, and I remember Reagan trying, basically teaching the public that it's okay to dislike your government, right? Yeah. The government's bad, which is really an awful thing to teach a populace, right? For me, a next big moment is Newt Gingrich, which is in very kind of summary form. We will stop literally at nothing to get what we want. Literally nothing. And he meant that, and they lived it. The Tea Party comes along. You gave us some of that history. It ends up being a much deeper cultural war and dragging the right wing with it way to the right, in shifting all of what was happening in the Republican Party such that it's almost unrecognizable to where it was 8 to 10 years ago. This kind of thing seems to be happening, around the globe. As we have authoritarians being accepted, authoritarian movements. Trump certainly unleashed some of that. He made it acceptable for those folks to rise up. But Trump was riding this wave of evolution of human thinking, of the populist movement. Maybe some of that was driven by social media. I don't know that the history books are clear about what's going to be written in that regard yet. How do you interpret all that? Where does all that come from? We're riding a wave that seems to be international and not just in the U.S. that has gotten us to where we are now.
Again, I'd argue we're living in a populist moment, and you're correct. It's not just in America. One quick thought before I address that, Chuck, because I haven't given this enough. I changed as well. We talk about how I couldn't support Trump for all the right, good reasons, but I changed. I was a very divisive politician. If you and I 7 years ago were having a conversation, say, about Black Lives Matter, and you brought up and you said to me, Joe, Black Lives Matter, 7 years ago, I would have said, Chuck, all lives matter. Get off of that Black Lives Matter crap. That was the old divisive Joe Walsh. The new Joe Walsh, who over the last few years has spent a lot of time talking to Black Americans, I understand now why it's important to say that phrase, Black Lives Matter. I'm very pro-cop. I'll be the first to raise my hand. I'm very pro-cop. That cops do not treat Black lives the same way they treat white lives. That's why that needs to be said. I only bring that up in that I'm still very libertarian in my politics. I used to be a jerk. I'm no longer a divisive jerk. I've grown and listened and opened my eyes and my heart to a lot of people. I think, again, we're in a populist moment around the world. I think the Republican Party as a national political party is dying. It is a party of middle-aged and older white people. Older white people die before young people die. The party is literally dying. It's not replacing itself. These middle-aged and older white folk, Chuck, are scared about what America is becoming. And they believe in this 1954 America where America was white and Christian and that the plant was right there in town and Dad walked to his job and you could say Merry Christmas everywhere and men were men, women were women, and men married women and there were two genders, and I could go on and on. That whole world has changed in a nanosecond. So I think there's a lot of fear that Republican and right-wing politicians and talkers have focused on. I want to go back to one thing you said. I have an innate distrust of government. I believe our founders did. Now, I think when Reagan said government's the problem, I related to a lot of that. I would acknowledge that post-Reagan, Gingrich and the Tea Party and Rush Limbaugh, everybody's taken it to a dark, ugly place. You and I may disagree on that, but I have a real innate distrust of government. I want to embrace good government, but I'm always watching government.
Yeah. Let's get into a little bit of your libertarianism, because I think that's at the core of some of that. I am not a believer that government is bad, but as a entrepreneur, investor, I believe that government, like all business, should strive to be highly efficient and effective. And it's not done that because it's hard in politics, and the reality is neither party knows how to do that. They talk about it. The Republicans tend to talk about it more, but it's mostly lip service. They don't know how to do it, and you certainly don't do it just by cutting budgets. You do it by knowing how to lead organizations to a culture of effectiveness and specific methodologies for driving, business process improvement, as an example. And we desperately need that. I don't dislike our government. I respect the people who serve us. The government is us. I am frustrated by our politics in that our politicians don't understand that and don't understand how to drive that efficiency. And don't understand how to do that outside of thinking that budgets are the way to do that. And so let's talk a little bit about being a libertarian, because I have always seen it as being some bit of a fanciful thing with not a whole lot of substance behind it. It tends to align with the Republican Party, primarily from a budgetary, budget hawk, get the government off our back perspective. And so tell me a little bit about that. Again, I think it is kind of fanciful. That's not connected to really an understanding of how to make government work. So where do you come from in that regard? And how does libertarianism fit in?
I wish I could find, Chuck, I don't like to call myself a conservative, because to me, a conservative sounds like an old, angry white guy. I'm not a formal libertarian. I'm just someone who believes in a much more limited government. I wish I had a better title for that. Look, I think generally government is too big and we ask government to do too much. I think we ask government, and I guess my bias, Chuck, always is that the more we ask government to do, the less we ask of ourselves. And I've read a bunch, you've read a bunch, but you look at the last 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 years. As government's grown, and the federal government since the New Deal on has grown, we can debate aspects of that. But I worry that many of our private sector institutions have atrophied. Our churches, our communities, our nonprofits, our charities, our neighborhoods. There was a time, now I sound like an old fart. There was a time in America where we looked after each other more. But now, boy, I'll tell you, I'm paying taxes, Joe. Government's supposed to do that. I don't need to help my neighbor down the street who just lost his job. That's kind of what motivates me. Look, healthcare, your area. You know so much more about healthcare than I do. I think the average American should pay for his or her day-to-day healthcare costs. I think government should only be there to help people who can't take care of themselves pay for healthcare. And I extend that to almost any policy area. I want government to help take care of people who can't take care of themselves. I want the rest of us to take care of ourselves and each other.
Yeah, and we're going to get into that more sometime.
Oh,
in
you
healthcare
eat my
in
lunch.
particular. We'll talk, not during this interview, but we're going to talk a lot more about healthcare, because I think it's a great example of what is the role of the government. And, we would agree, I think mostly that, hey, we need a military, we need education, we need a backstop in healthcare. We need roads and bridges. There are a lot of things that we need. And we also know historically that as bad as, not as bad, where there are examples, unfortunately way too many right now, of government inefficiency and ineffectiveness, we also know that no matter what the government program, the private sector is very good at duping the government and duping the public to make outrageous amounts of money on that. Take, the COVID response as an example. Take, Medicare.
Yeah.
It's embarrassing what happens oftentimes in that intersection between the private sector and government. So we need government watchdogs, and so again, where in all that does libertarianism really fit? I think all of us would want the smallest government possible, but we want the right government. We want it to be doing the right work that enhances the quality of life and the business atmosphere of the United States. And that's really at the core. And if we can agree on that, which I think people across the spectrum would do, then we can start having rational conversation about just, what should that be and how should it really run from an efficiency and effectiveness
Perfectly put.
perspective.
And Chuck, I'm not there are libertarians that don't want government doing a damn thing. I'm not a libertarian. And so I understand that there is a role for the federal government. There's a role for the government to do things that only the government can do, that only the federal government can do. I've really opened my eyes over the last 5 or 6 years as well, Chuck, to the issue of the environment and the climate. There are things in this arena that only the government can do and will do. And I'm a free market guy, but the free market on its own is not going to be incentivized to care for our environment. So I acknowledge, right, there are things that our government has to do. But we've dramatically extended that. And so now we have, I think part of the problem with a government that's disconnected from its people is because it's so big and we've asked it to do so much that I don't think it's doing the basic things it needs to do very well anymore. And I wish we could have this re-examination of, but I've been there and I know in Congress it ain't going to happen. I don't believe our political system can fix what ails it. I mean, Chuck, we did the same thing. I was there. We threatened to shut down the government because we were in debt and broke and all the rest. And then we proposed these silly little cuts in non-defense discretionary spending that wouldn't make any difference and would actually hurt low-income people. You and I know that the vast majority, the biggest and fastest growing piece of the federal budget is what we call these healthcare entitlement programs for an aging population. Neither political party wants to even touch these. So we're not serious about spending.
Yeah, and it's hard to get there. And the reality is there are plenty of people who say, the federal government's bad, we should leave it to the states. But there's not that much difference between the state governments and the federal government. There are better and worse state governments, but still they have the same challenges that the federal government has and whatnot. We don't have a whole lot of time left. Let's just get into some of your positions, your political positions. We talked a little bit about the libertarian bent. And so give us a sense of some of your positions, because you allude to them on your calls and during your interviews, but you don't really get into them too deeply. And so I'm going to hit some of the more common ones. We've talked mostly about the deficit in the economy, which you and I would agree on. Tell me about abortion. Where do you stand on abortion, and what should that look like, either nationally or
quick
at a state
answer.
level?
So I've always been pro-life. I no longer use that term pro-life because everybody's pro-life. But I've always opposed abortion. I've always been a Republican that said overturn Roe v. Wade because I just thought that was a flawed decision. Return it to the people and let the people decide. Well, the people are deciding in blue, purple, and red states. And so I think as someone who opposes abortion, we're going to end up as a country, Chuck, where most Americans are. And kind of what Roe eventually said, which is there's kind of a point of viability there. Beyond that point of viability, all right, there need to be restrictions. But before that, it's a woman and a doctor's decision. I think that's where America is going to end up.
Right, yeah. And I think my perspective on that is I think abortion is a terrible thing. I don't want it to happen, but legislating it I don't think is the right approach. We have to get serious about the social determinants that lead to people wanting or needing abortions and address it from that perspective. You can't be a party of less intervention in our lives, except for where we want to intervene in your life, in particular from a religious perspective. And I think that there's a very slippery slope and a bunch of conflict.
Agreed, Chuck. And this is one where I often get picked apart for some hypocrisy. Our side does, because of what you just said, and it's apt and it's correct. I don't want government involved in my life, except here is that, and you know this, there are people who believe from the moment of conception that's a life, and so abortion is murder. And that's what certain people in this country believe. And then there are people in the country who believe up until I have a child, I can abort that child. That's not where most Americans are. And Chuck, these crazy extreme bills that some of the red states are passing, a ban at 6 weeks. You don't even know you're pregnant at 6 weeks. There's going to be a backlash against the Republican Party for a lot of this. Yeah,
and there should be. I think the challenge is that, almost all human beings would agree that murder is bad, right? And by murder, we mean of a living human being. Pre-birth, things get much fuzzier from a public perspective, from an agreement perspective in terms of where life begins. So we move from universal acceptance that murder is bad to a much fuzzier, certainly with a lot of religious overtones, of what happens to a baby.
Is there
that
a
is not
point
yet
there,
born.
Chuck? Is there a point in your mind in a pregnancy where, as a physician, where you could remove that baby, that fetus, and that baby fetus could survive on its own? As a libertarian, I've always felt at that point, the government has a duty to protect that life past viability. Does that make sense?
That makes sense, and I think that's where a lot of rational people would come down, and it's a matter of really creating a much safer place for that discussion that loses its religious overtones, because we still believe, I think, with the exception of the Speaker of the House and the separation of
By
church
the
and
way,
state.
Chuck, that Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, who quite literally believes that we should be a Christian nation, and quite literally believes America should be a white Christian nation, which should be abhorrent to all of us. The Republican Party base, Chuck, is pretty much where he is.
Right, understood. Your perspective on immigration?
I am. Damn it, nobody should be in this country illegally. But damn it, open our arms. We need to dramatically increase legal immigration.
And neither party has been very good at that. And when the other party's in power, they always blame it on the other party, as the Republicans are doing now, which is phenomenally disingenuous. But that's politics. And you're right. We need much more coherent immigration policy.
And today's
and
Republican Party wants to limit legal immigration as well, and that's just horrible.
That's terrible. We are a country of immigrants. First Amendment. You are rabid about the First Amendment in a way that I find
It's a pet peeve.
fascinating. The one interview you did, I can't remember his name, on the First Amendment, putting the gag order on Trump was that was a phenomenal interview. I learned so much from that.
Well, and
you're rabid about it.
I am. This goes, Chuck, to my innate fear of a government that would try to take away my rights and shut me up. We do not criminalize speech in this country. We defeat ugly hate speech with better speech and stronger speech. I am a free speech absolutist. I understand that no right is absolute. I'm a big Second Amendment guy. It's not absolute. You can't yell, fire in a crowded theater. You cannot incite specific acts of violence. But short of that, Chuck, we come on, sticks and stones, man, may break my bones, but names, man, we become so soft that we let words bother us. I don't like that.
Yeah. There are challenges to that. We know that social media is going to force us to address that. We know that AI is going to force us to address that. My personal perspective is that Fox is so toxic to the body politic and to human thinking, to susceptible humans and the way that they think, and is so diverted the purpose of our democracy that it creates the environment for us to think much more deeply about what such limitations should be. You and I talked about this. If I poured some toxin into the water supply and hurt a bunch of people, that would not be okay. Why is it okay to pour a bunch of toxins into not the water supply, but the listening supply, the air supply, the communication supply,
and I would
get
ask
away
my good
with
friend
that?
Chuck Kilo, if Fox is that toxic, what would you have your government do to Fox?
I think that is a great question.
That scares me, and that scares me.
We're interviewing you. That's right, yeah. And so your point is you are just a rabid protector of the First Amendment, which I respect. I think we're going to be forced to take that on, to think about where some rational boundaries are. As an example, you have freedom of speech in your personal setting, but you don't have it in a public setting or something along those lines. I don't know. I'm not smart enough to figure that out, but I know that we need to do a lot of
And the last
deep
thing I'll
thinking
say
about
is
that.
I never, ever, ever want my government determining what is hateful speech. Oh my God, I don't want them to have that
Right.
power. Like you can hate against.
Yeah, it would certainly have to be some panel of citizens or something like that. I don't know how we protect truth and truthfulness, and again separate political spin from overt lying to the public. And as you know, one of the biggest fears of many of the AI leaders is what AI is going to do to
Yeah.
politics.
Yeah.
And to false information
Yeah.
and that sort of thing. Yeah. Your support of Israel, kind of off the charts. I'm a supporter of Israel. Your support is really impressive. Tell us about that.
I've lost a lot of my new support on the left because of my support of Israel. I'm Chuck. I'm off the charts. If I were 10 years younger, I'd be over right now fighting for Israel. It's not religious with me. It's spiritual, it's philosophical, it's political. It is this miracle of a little island of democracy in a sea of Islamic tyranny. They are our closest ally. They are most like us, any country in the world. I just have such an affinity for Israel. I'm very educated on the topic, and I understand what the issues are. But to me, it's really simple in that right now, at this moment in time, Hamas is evil. The Palestinian people are not. That terror group needs to be gone somehow so that reasonable, moderate Muslims and Arabs can sit down with Israel and figure some shit out.
Yeah, and that's a super tough one. Many of those Palestinians and more rational Arabs would say that they have tried to do that, and it hasn't gone anywhere. And so, the depth of the grievance is such that it has created the substrate for situations like this, without trying to give an excuse that this was okay in any way, shape, or form. That conversation is really kind of at the center of some of the angst around how we got here.
It is. I'll tell you what, Chuck. Again, I'm off the charts pro-Israel. Politically, this issue is going to hurt Joe Biden. And I say this, I am off the charts pro-Israel. I am off the charts that Donald Trump is an existential threat to our democracy. What's happening in the Middle East is going to help reelect Trump, because this is creating a real divide in the Democratic Party.
Yeah, it is. So let's turn to that. How do we keep Trump out of the White House?
The one thing I know for certain, and I don't know a lot, is that there are more people in this country who oppose him than support him. If we vote, if we all vote, he loses. What will keep him from winning is if we don't. If this big coalition, Chuck, of principled libertarian conservatives like me and center right, center left, Democrats and progressives and socialists and all of us, in 2020, we all locked arms to stop him. And we only beat him by a little bit electorally. We should get rid of the Electoral College, by the way. That's another discussion. But that coalition has to hold because his support is motivated. And unlike a lot of my peers who comment on this, I think his support's growing. So our coalition needs to really hang together. And right now, I'm not convinced it will because Joe Biden's really old.
Yeah, there's work to be done there. As a thought exercise, what do you think would happen is just a provocative statement. Joe Biden came out and said, look, Republicans and Donald Trump, if Trump wins the election, we know for certain that that means that it was a corrupt election, that you did something to manipulate it. And if Trump wins, I'm not leaving the White House. How would the Republicans respond to that? How would Trump respond to that?
The beauty of that, Chuck, and it's wonderful the way you put that, is Joe Biden will never do that, right? Only one man in our history has done that. And by the way, that one man, Trump, is doing it and will do it again. I fear 24 could be worse than 20 when it comes to the legitimacy of our election.
Yeah, well, what's apparent is most of the entire rational world fears that, because it will not just be a disaster for the United States, it will be an international disaster from which we may never recover, or it may take decades and decades for us to recover, as every totalitarian authoritarian is unleashed around the country, around the world, and all the subsequent events from that follow that.
I'll say one quick thing. The last 42 days has revealed a real problem with anti-Semitism and antagonism toward Israel on the left. But I've been railing for years now about the embrace of authoritarianism on the right. It's real, Chuck, and it's just so profound. I come from the right. It just profoundly disappoints me that the right really does want a strongman, a dictator. I mean, it's real.
Right. We shared some literature on this, but we hadn't talked about it. George Lakoff, a now retired sociologist, very evidence-based social science researcher. I don't think he was a sociologist, more a linguist from UCSF. He studied this a lot. And I certainly believe in genetics and how genetics impact us. There's always nurture versus nature, both the genetics and then our upbringing and all the things that happen to us that shape our opinion. His research said the people who tend to be on the right tend to have what seems to be a genetic makeup of more respect for authoritarian type of figures, the father figure. Those who are on the left tend to much more respect thinking, creativity, open-mindedness, and this may be the trajectory that we're on, is that has really been unleashed, and that populism and the people who are supporting Trump, who you would never think would be on that side of the aisle, because most of the policies go against their best interests, they are responding to that, the authoritarian, the father figure, all of which is more and more unleashed by social media and the lack of any restraint to social media.
Perfectly put. Agreed. It's a real concern.
Yeah. What else do you have to say for yourself?
I don't like this. I don't like talking this much. Hey, Chuck, this has been interesting. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you for the opportunity. Fascinating. I really appreciate the work you're doing. I go back and say that this Thanksgiving week that we're talking. I'm very thankful for you, Joe, and the work that you've done and the example that you've set for everybody. We didn't argue very much. It's possible that any interview is better and better if you're arguing.
Answer
more.
this. I'm going to ask you one question, you big jerk. What one or two issues would you and I most disagree on?
I would think almost none. We would talk about implementation challenges and implementation methodologies. And from my perspective, when you have rational people in the room and rational and informed people in the room, and we know, God knows these days, many people are not rational and informed. And I try to talk to my conservative friends. They shut you down so fast. They come up with Fox News talking points, which are mostly nonsense, and there is no rational conversation, no respectful conversation. In that context, I think we have a lot in common, and I think what we both believe is when we actually get back to that, that's how we solve problems. And so I think we're aligned on a lot of issues. I wouldn't say we disagree on abortion. I'd say we would think about what do we mean. How do we implement a rational abortion, policy? I didn't agree with what we said earlier on education. I believe in a public education system, but I'd like to talk much, much more about that to understand your perspective, and then find a middle ground, because I know I have a lot to learn from people, and I am always impressed with how much I learn from truly informed, deeply thoughtful people about these issues. And again, that's what you are modeling, and I so respect you for that. So I think that's what we need more of. We need more of that kind of dialogue and that kind of massaging, sausage making, right? We do best when we bring all of our ideas to the table and we make sausage out of it. It's an ugly process, but it doesn't happen with contentiousness. It happens with respectful
Well, right now
conversation.
we are, as a country, we're fighting. We're not doing any of that. We're just plain fighting. And
That's it.
sadly, it's going to last another year. Chuck Kilo, everybody. Chuck, thank you so much, my friend. Hope everybody enjoyed this.
Joe, thank you.
Thank you for listening. Remember to listen, share, and follow White Flag with Joe Walsh on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere great podcasts are found. And be sure to leave a 5-star review. This has been White Flag with Joe Walsh.